At 18, Ethan Carter owned everything he had left in the world inside the bed of an old pickup truck. A worn backpack, a sleeping bag, a toolbox, and $247 that had to last him until he figured out what to do with the rest of his life. His stepfather had thrown him out the day he turned 18, telling him he was old enough to survive on his own. For nearly 2 weeks, Ethan slept in his truck wherever he could park without being chased away. Every morning, he woke up colder than the last, wondering if this was what the rest of his life was going to look like. Then he made the kind of decision that made absolutely no sense. At a county auction, with almost all the money he had left, Ethan bought a broken snow cabin high in the mountains for just $200. The roof sagged beneath years of heavy snow. Most of the windows were shattered. The chimney leaned like it could collapse at any moment. Even the auctioneer laughed as he handed Ethan the paperwork. A few people shook their heads. One man muttered, "That kid just paid $200 for a place even the bears won't live in." Maybe they were right. For 3 long weeks, Ethan worked alone, patching holes, clearing snow, and trying to make the old cabin livable before the next storm rolled in. Then, one freezing afternoon, while pulling the rusted cast-iron stove away from the wall, he noticed something strange. The floor underneath didn't sound solid. Curious, he pried up one loose stone. Beneath it was a thick iron hatch buried under decades of dust. His hands trembled as he grabbed the old metal ring and pulled. The hatch slowly creaked open, and what Ethan saw beneath that stove would change not only his own life, but the forgotten history of an entire mountain town. But before we uncover what was hidden there for more than 60 years, let me know where you're listening from today and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing how these stories bring people together from all around the world. If you're just starting your morning, I hope you have a peaceful and wonderful day ahead. If you're listening tonight, I hope this story keeps you company until the very end. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten family legacies, hidden secrets, and ordinary people finding hope when life seems impossible, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support truly helps more people discover these stories. Now, let's go back to the day an 18-year-old homeless boy bought the most worthless cabin anyone had ever seen, and unknowingly uncovered the secret waiting beneath its old stove. The first thing Ethan Carter packed was not his clothes. It was the old steel toolbox his grandfather had given his mother years before she passed away. Most of the tools inside were worn smooth from decades of use, but to Ethan, they were the only things that had ever felt dependable. He placed the heavy box into the bed of his faded pickup truck, followed by a sleeping bag, a duffel filled with clothes, and a cardboard box holding a few family photographs he refused to leave behind. Everything else stayed inside the house. His stepfather leaned against the front porch with folded arms, watching without offering a single word of help. When Ethan finished loading the truck, he turned toward the front door one last time, hoping for some sign that this was only another angry argument. Instead, his stepfather tossed a small envelope onto the gravel driveway. "Happy 18th birthday," he said coldly. "You're a man now. Figure it out yourself." Ethan picked up the envelope. Inside were the last $247 left from the small survivor benefits his mother had saved for him. The front door closed before he could say goodbye to the only home he had ever known. He drove until the fuel gauge hovered just above empty. That first night, he parked behind a closed hardware store and pulled his sleeping bag across the truck seat. Every sound outside made him open his eyes. A passing train, rain tapping the windshield, a police cruiser rolling slowly through the parking lot before moving on. By morning, the windows were covered with condensation, and his neck ached from trying to sleep sitting upright. Over the next 12 days, life became a routine of small calculations. $5 for gas meant less money for food. Buying a sandwich meant skipping breakfast the next morning. He washed up in public restrooms before filling out job applications that rarely led anywhere. Employers wanted experience. Some wanted an address. Others simply never called back. At night, he searched for quiet places to park where nobody would knock on the window and tell him to leave. Despite everything, Ethan refused to spend the money his mother had left unless absolutely necessary. It was all that remained of the life she had tried to build for him. One afternoon, while sitting inside the public library to warm up, he noticed a flyer pinned to the community board. County property auction, abandoned buildings, farm equipment, land parcels, everything sold as is. Ethan almost walked away. He had no business thinking about buying property when he barely had enough money to eat. Yet something made him fold the paper and slip it into his pocket. 2 days later, he drove to the auction grounds. Most buyers wore heavy work boots and talked confidently about investments and renovation costs. Ethan stayed near the back, listening quietly. Old tractors sold first, then empty lots, then a storage shed. Finally, the auctioneer unfolded another sheet of paper. "Next item," he announced. An abandoned mountain snow cabin. Structural damage, no utilities, access road partially washed out. Starting bid, $200. A faded photograph appeared on a screen beside him. The cabin looked forgotten beneath deep snow. The roof sagged. Several windows were broken. The chimney leaned dangerously to one side. No one raised a hand. Someone near Ethan laughed. That place should have been demolished years ago. The auctioneer lowered his voice. "Any interest?" $200. Ethan stared at the picture. It wasn't much, but it had walls. It had a roof, even if the roof needed work. Most importantly, nobody could tell him to leave. Before he had time to question himself, his hand rose into the air. $200, he said. The crowd turned toward the young stranger in worn-out clothes. A man in a baseball cap chuckled. "Kid's buying himself a snow-covered coffin." Another shook his head. "He'll be back here next month trying to give it away." Even the auctioneer smiled with surprise before bringing the gavel down. "Sold!" Ethan signed the paperwork with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that $47 was all he had left. The drive into the mountains took nearly 3 hours. The narrow road climbed through thick pine forests before ending at a weathered gate hanging crooked on one hinge. Beyond it stood the cabin exactly as the photograph had shown. Snow drifted against the porch steps. The front door resisted before finally swinging open with a long groan. Inside, the air smelled of dust, damp wood, and old smoke. Broken chairs lay scattered across the floor. Wind slipped through cracked window frames. Yet for the first time since leaving home, Ethan stood somewhere that belonged to him. Over the following 3 weeks, he worked from sunrise until darkness. He cleared fallen branches, patched sections of the leaking roof with salvaged tin, replaced shattered boards across the porch, and hauled buckets of snowmelt for cleaning. Progress came slowly, but every repaired wall made the cabin feel a little less abandoned. Late one freezing afternoon, while trying to move the heavy cast-iron stove so he could inspect the chimney behind it, Ethan shoved with all his strength until the stove scraped several inches across the wooden floor. As he caught his breath, he noticed something that made him stop moving altogether. The floor beneath the stove answered with a hollow sound unlike the solid planks surrounding it. Ethan crouched beside the cast iron stove and knocked on the floor again with the handle of a screwdriver. The hollow sound came back, softer this time, but unmistakable. Every other board in the cabin answered with a dull, solid thud. Only this small section beneath the stove echoed as though there were empty space below. He frowned, brushing away decades of ash and dust with the sleeve of his jacket. The light outside was already fading, and the mountain air slipping through the broken window frames reminded him that another freezing night was only an hour away. Whatever was under the floor could wait. Staying warm could not. He shoved the heavy stove back into place as best he could and fed another split log into the firebox. The chimney drew unevenly, filling the room with the faint smell of old smoke before finally pulling it outside. It wasn't perfect, but it kept the cabin above freezing. That alone felt like a victory. The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise inside his sleeping bag, his breath visible in the dim light. Frost lined the inside of the windows. He spent the first part of the day patching another section of the roof where melted snow had been dripping onto the kitchen floor. Every repair took longer than expected because almost nothing fit together anymore. Nails bent, boards split, rusted hinges snapped when touched. More than once he wondered if the people at the auction had been right. Maybe he had wasted the last real chance he had. By noon, his stomach reminded him he had only one can of soup left. He drove nearly 30 miles into the nearest town, bought bread, canned beans, and a small bag of rice with careful attention to every dollar, then stopped at the local hardware store hoping to find inexpensive chimney mortar. As he loaded the supplies into his truck, an elderly woman carrying bird seed paused beside him. She glanced toward the mountain road, and then at the weathered lumber sticking out of the truck bed. "You aren't the young fellow who bought the old snow cabin, are you?" she asked. Ethan smiled politely. "I guess word travels fast." "It usually does around here." She extended a gloved hand. "I'm Martha Ellis. I live about a mile down the mountain from that place." Ethan shook her hand. "Ethan Carter." Martha studied him for a moment, noticing the patched jacket, the tired eyes, and the supplies carefully counted in the truck. "Living there already?" "Trying to." She nodded slowly. "That cabin's been empty for a long time." There was a brief silence before she added quietly, "People stop going near it for a reason." Ethan waited, expecting her to explain. But instead, she smiled faintly and changed the subject. "If your truck refuses to start in this weather, I've got a landline. You'll see the mailbox with the blue paint." "Thank you." "Just don't let the stories scare you away." Before Ethan could ask what stories she meant, Martha climbed into her old station wagon and drove away. Her unfinished sentence stayed with him all the way back up the mountain. That afternoon, he repaired one of the broken front windows using salvaged boards and clear plastic sheeting. The cabin immediately felt less exposed to the wind. Later, he cleared years of soot from around the chimney base inside the kitchen. As he worked, he noticed something odd. The cast iron stove didn't sit squarely against the stone hearth. Instead, it rested several inches farther forward than the scorch marks on the floor suggested it originally had. Curious. He knelt and brushed away more dirt. Faint outlines in the dusty floor showed where the stove's legs had once stood for many years before being moved. Someone had deliberately repositioned it. There was no practical reason to shift such a heavy stove only a short distance. He examined the surrounding stones more carefully. Most were rough and uneven with age, but one rectangular stone beneath the stove looked different. Its edges were cleaner. The surface carried fewer burn marks despite being directly beneath the firebox. almost as if it had been replaced years later. Ethan reached out and ran his fingers across it. Near one corner, hidden beneath layers of soot, he felt a shallow groove. He wiped it clean with a damp rag until a small carved symbol slowly emerged from the grime. It wasn't a crack or random scratch. Someone had carefully etched a simple mark into the stone many years before, and seeing it made the hollow sound beneath the floor suddenly feel much less like an accident. The carved mark stayed in Ethan's mind long after the fire burned low. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, staring at the stove as if it might explain itself. Outside, wind pressed snow against the cabin, and every old board creaked under the cold. He wanted to believe the mark was nothing more than some builder's habit, a sign left by a mason who liked carving little shapes into stone. But the hollow sound beneath the floor, the shifted stove, and the cleaner rectangular slab all pointed to the same uncomfortable thought. Someone had hidden something there. By morning, curiosity had beaten common sense. Ethan let the fire die down, wrapped both hands in work gloves, and began dragging the cast iron stove away from the hearth. It moved only an inch at first, shrieking against the floor. He braced one boot against the wall and pulled again. The stove scraped forward, leaving black trails in the dust. Sweat gathered under his jacket despite the cold. After nearly half an hour, he had moved it far enough to expose the marked stone completely. Up close, the symbol looked like two simple lines crossing inside a rough circle. Beneath it, the mortar around the slab seemed older and darker than the rest, but cracked in several places. Ethan knelt with a chisel from his grandfather's toolbox and worked carefully along the edges. Chips of mortar broke loose. Dust stung his eyes. Twice the chisel slipped and scraped his knuckles. Still, the stone refused to move. By noon, his arms trembled from effort. He sat back, frustrated and hungry, knowing brute force might break whatever lay beneath. Then he remembered Martha's words about her blue mailbox and landline. He did not want to ask for help. Asking meant admitting how little he knew. But he also knew pride would not open the floor. Martha answered the door before he finished knocking, as if she had seen him coming from the window. "Cabin giving you trouble already?" she asked. "The stove was moved," Ethan said. "There's a marked stone under it. I think there's some kind of hatch." Her face changed so quickly he almost missed it. Surprise, then worry, then a careful blankness. "You should leave old things alone sometimes." "Do you know what it is?" Martha looked past him toward the snowy trees. "No, but I know someone with better tools than yours." She called a repair shop in town, and by mid-afternoon a tow truck climbed the mountain road with chains on its tires. The driver was a broad-shouldered man in a grease-stained coat who introduced himself as Ben Dawson. He stepped into the cabin, looked at the exposed stone, then gave Ethan a sideways smile. "You bought the $200 disaster?" "That's me." "Could be worse," Ben said. "At least disasters usually come with interesting problems, unlike the men at the auction." He did not laugh cruelly. He set down a pry bar, a hammer, and a small work light, then knelt beside Ethan. Together they cleared the rest of the mortar. Ben worked with patient confidence, tapping instead of smashing, pausing whenever the stone shifted. After several attempts, the slab finally lifted with a gritty groan. Beneath it was not bare dirt, but a round iron plate set into the floor beams. A rusted ring lay flat against its center. Ethan's pulse quickened. Ben whistled softly. That's not normal cabin construction. The ring would not move at first. Rust had sealed it in place. Ben sprayed oil around the edges while Ethan held the light. They waited, tried again, failed, and tried once more with the pry bar hooked through the ring. The plate gave suddenly, opening with a sharp crack that made both of them jump back. Cold air breathed up from below, stale and dry, carrying the smell of old wood and dust. Ethan lowered the work light into the opening. The space beneath was narrow, more like a hidden compartment than a cellar. For one terrible second, he imagined bones or something worse waiting there. But all he saw was dust, cobwebs, and a wooden box tucked against the far side. Ben reached down first but could not quite grab it. Ethan lay flat on his stomach, stretched his arm through the opening, and dragged the box toward the light. It was heavier than it looked. The wood was dark with age, bound by thin strips of corroded metal. A small lock hung from the front, green with oxidation. Neither of them spoke while Ethan set it on the floorboards. His hands left pale streaks in the dust across the lid. Ben leaned closer. "Anything written on it?" Ethan wiped the top with his sleeve. At first there was only grime. Then letters appeared, shallow but clear, carved into the wood by someone who had taken their time. Ethan froze. His mouth went dry. The name on the lid was not a stranger's name. It was his own. Carter. Ethan stared at the carved name until the letters blurred in the work light. Carter. Not painted, not scratched recently, but cut deep into the lid long before he was born. Ben looked from the box to Ethan's face and lowered his voice. "That your family?" Ethan nodded slowly. "My last name." For a moment, the cabin felt too quiet. The wind had stopped outside, and even the old walls seemed to be listening. Ethan touched the lock, half expecting it to crumble, but it held firm. "I don't understand," he said. "My family was never from here. At least, nobody ever told me we were." Ben crouched beside the box. Sometimes families leave places and stop talking about why. He tried not to sound too serious, but Ethan heard the weight in his words. They searched the cabin for a key until dusk, checking drawers, shelves, cracks in the floor, and the empty cupboards along the kitchen wall. Nothing turned up except mouse nests, a bent spoon, and an old button. Finally, Ben returned with a small set of picks from his truck. "I open locked vehicles for a living," he said. "Old boxes are not exactly my specialty, but we can be gentle." Ethan held the lamp steady while Ben worked. The lock resisted. Clicked once, then stuck. Ben adjusted the pick, tapped the side with the handle of a screwdriver, and tried again. This time the lock sprang open with a dry snap that made Ethan flinch. Neither of them moved at first. Opening the box felt different from finding it. The moment before the lid lifted, it still belonged to the past. After that, it would belong to him too. Ethan raised the lid. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a small brass key tied with dark string, several black and white photographs, and a leather journal swollen with age. The photographs were on top. Ethan picked one up carefully. It showed a younger man standing beside the same cabin, though the porch had been straight then, and the windows unbroken. Snow rose in high banks around him. He wore work gloves and a heavy coat, his face serious but kind. On the back, written in faded pencil, were two words: Samuel Carter. Ethan read the name aloud, and it landed in the room like a footstep from someone long gone. Ben leaned closer. "Relative, I don't know." Ethan's throat tightened. His mother had spoken little about family. Most of her stories began after she left home. Never before. He opened the journal with both hands. The first pages were filled with neat handwriting, dated winter 1962. Samuel wrote about snowfall so deep it swallowed fence posts, about families trapped along the ridge, about hauling food by sled when trucks could no longer reach the upper road. Ethan turned another page and found sketches of the cabin, the stove, and lines drawn beneath the floor. One phrase appeared more than once: "Keep the first cache dry." Ben tapped the page. First cache? Ethan looked at the brass key in the box. Then there was more than one. He kept reading until the fire burned low. Samuel's entries were brief, practical, almost plain, but something human lived between the lines. He wrote names of families who needed flour, medicine, blankets, kerosene. He wrote about children coughing from smoke in a crowded house. He wrote about promising a woman named Ruth Mercer that no one on the ridge would be left behind. Ethan felt ashamed for not knowing him. A man with his name had once walked these same floors, fed this same stove, and carried supplies through storms while Ethan had grown up believing his family history was empty. A knock at the door startled them both. Ben rose first. When he opened it, cold air swept in around a tall, older man in an expensive dark coat. His boots were too clean for the mountain. "Evening," the man said, looking past Ben toward Ethan. "You must be the young buyer." Ethan stood, instinctively closing the journal. "That's right, Victor Hale." The man smiled, but his eyes moved quickly around the cabin, pausing on the displaced stove and the open floor. "I own several properties in the area. I heard you bought this place. Thought I'd save you some trouble." Ethan said nothing. Victor reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I'll give you $5,000 for it. Cashier's check by tomorrow. More than fair for a damaged cabin with no utilities." Ben glanced at Ethan, surprised. $47 had been all Ethan owned 3 weeks ago. $5,000 should have felt like rescue. Instead, the offer made the room feel colder. "Why would you pay that much?" Ethan asked. Victor's smile tightened. "Sentimental reasons. My family has been in this town a long time. I'm not selling." Victor studied him for a long moment. "Think carefully. Places like this cost more than they give." After he left, Ben locked the door and looked at the box. That was strange. Ethan opened the journal again, hands unsteady now for a different reason. Near the middle, he found the edge of a torn page. Someone had ripped it out cleanly, leaving only a narrow strip behind. On that remaining strip, Samuel had written 3 words before the rest vanished. The second cache. Ethan slept badly after finding the torn page. Every time the wind shifted against the cabin walls, he woke thinking Victor Hale had returned. By morning, the fire had burned down to red coals, and the journal lay beside his sleeping bag, where he had kept it within reach all night. He opened it again while eating the last slice of bread from town. The missing page still bothered him more than anything else. Samuel Carter had written careful records of weather, supplies, and families in need. But someone had removed the one page that mentioned the second cache. That meant somebody else had once known what was hidden. Ethan drove into town with the journal wrapped in a towel on the passenger seat. The public records office sat behind the courthouse, a narrow room that smelled of paper dust and floor polish. The clerk looked doubtful when Ethan asked for anything connected to Samuel Carter. "What years?" she asked. "Around 1962, Ethan said. "Maybe earlier." She typed, searched, frowned, and shook her head. "No property under that name. No business licenses. No death record in this county that I can see." Ethan pointed toward the mountain on the faded wall map behind her desk. He lived in that cabin. Then maybe it wasn't recorded properly. Her voice was polite, but final. Old mountain parcels can be messy. Ethan left with copies of nothing and a heavier feeling in his chest. A man had written pages about helping people through a brutal winter. Yet the town held no trace of him. Outside, he almost walked to his truck, then remembered Martha. Her blue mailbox stood half buried in snow beside her narrow road. When she opened the door, she looked at the journal in his hand and sighed as if she had expected this day for years. "You found Samuel," she said. Ethan stepped inside her warm kitchen, where a kettle hissed on the stove. "You knew him? I was a child, but everyone on the ridge knew his name once." Martha poured tea with slow, careful hands. "During the winter of '62, snow cut people off for weeks. Samuel carried food when others wouldn't leave their fires. He repaired stoves, patched roofs, shared kerosene. My little brother had pneumonia. Samuel brought medicine from town on a sled after the road vanished." Ethan looked down at the journal. "Then why is there no record of him?" Martha's face tightened. "Because after the fire, people needed someone to blame." "What fire?" She sat across from him but did not drink her tea. A supply building burned near the old ridge road. Some families had taken shelter there during a storm. Not everyone got out. The official story said Samuel stored fuel carelessly and caused it. Ethan felt the words like cold water. Did he? Martha's eyes grew sharp. "No, my father never believed that. Many didn't, but Samuel was poor, stubborn, and already disliked by men who wanted control of the mountain property. After the fire, the Hales bought up land cheap from frightened families. Samuel disappeared from public memory because it was easier for the town to forget than admit they had turned on the wrong man. Ethan remembered Victor's clean boots in the ruined cabin and his strange offer. "Victor Hale came by last night, offered me $5,000. Martha went still. "Then he knows enough to be worried." "Worried about what? About whatever Samuel kept?" She pushed her chair back and went to a cupboard. From behind a stack of old recipe tins, she took out a yellowed envelope sealed but never mailed. "My father kept this. Said Samuel left it with him near the end, but he was afraid to deliver it after everything happened." Ethan accepted it carefully. The front bore no address, only the words, "For my family." When truth has a safer road. His hands shook as he opened it. The letter inside was written in the same neat hand as the journal, but less steady. Samuel wrote that he had hidden proof because men with money could bury words spoken aloud. He wrote that the first cache under the stove was only meant to guide blood back to the truth. Ethan read faster, barely breathing. Samuel mentioned records, supplies, names, and a place beyond the cabin where the snow stayed deep even in spring. Near the bottom of the letter was a line that made Ethan look up at Martha in silence. "If the first cache is found, take the brass key to the stone shelter above the north ridge, beneath the leaning pine. There the second cellar waits." Ethan read Samuel's letter 3 more times before he allowed himself to believe the words were real. The brass key, the north ridge, the leaning pine, the second cellar. Each detail felt less like a clue and more like an invitation from a man who had waited 60 years for someone to listen. Martha insisted he should not go alone. The mountain had changed since she was a girl, and winter could turn a familiar path dangerous in minutes. Ethan knew she was right. So he drove to Ben's repair shop with the letter folded safely inside his jacket. Ben listened without interrupting, wiping grease from his hands as Ethan explained the hidden compartment, the letter, and the place Samuel had described. When Ethan finished, Ben looked toward the snow clouds gathering over the ridge. "We go today, or we wait until after the storm?" "Today," Ethan said. "If Victor already knows something, I don't want to give him time." Ben did not argue. He packed a rope, a crowbar, flashlights, spare gloves, and a shovel into his truck, then followed Ethan back toward the cabin. They parked near the crooked gate because the upper path was too buried for vehicles. From there they climbed on foot, using Samuel's rough sketch and Martha's childhood memory of the ridge. The snow reached Ethan's knees in places. Branches dropped white powder across his shoulders. Twice he slipped on ice hidden beneath the drifts, and once Ben caught his arm before he slid toward a shallow ravine. "You sure your ancestor didn't believe in putting secrets somewhere warmer?" Ben muttered. Ethan managed a tired smile, but his chest burned with effort. After nearly an hour, they found the leaning pine. It stood at the edge of a rise, bent by decades of wind, its trunk angled over a cluster of stones. At first, Ethan saw only boulders and snow. Then Ben brushed aside a thick layer of ice and exposed the top of a low stone wall built into the slope itself. Together they cleared the entrance. A narrow wooden door appeared, gray with age but still solid beneath the frost. An iron lock hung from a bracket in the center. Ethan took the brass key from his pocket. For a moment his hand paused. The key had waited in darkness under the stove for longer than most people lived. Now it turned with a stiff, reluctant click. The door opened inward on a wave of dry, cold air. Their flashlights revealed stone shelves built along both walls. Some held rusted cans with labels eaten by time. Others held folded wool blankets sealed in old canvas. There were lanterns, jars, tools, sacks long emptied by age, and wooden crates stacked neatly as if Samuel had left only yesterday and planned to return before nightfall. Ethan stepped inside slowly. This was not a treasure room. It was a survival room. Every object had been chosen for winter, hunger, sickness, or fear. On one shelf, names were written in pencil across small tags tied to bundles. Mercer, Ellis, Dawson, Reed. Ben noticed his own family name and grew quiet. "My grandmother used to say someone brought them flour during the big snow," he said. "She never said who." Ethan touched the tag carefully, feeling an unexpected warmth behind his ribs. Samuel had not written about helping people to make himself important. He had done it because they needed help. In the back of the shelter, behind a half-collapsed stack of crates, Ben found a newer-looking stone wall that did not match the rougher sides around it. "This was sealed after," he said. They worked carefully, pulling stones loose one by one. Behind the wall was a smaller chamber, no larger than a closet. Inside sat several metal boxes, a bundle of papers wrapped in waxed cloth, and ledgers protected inside a tin case. Ethan carried everything into the light of the main room. Before he could open the tin, voices echoed faintly outside. He and Ben froze. Through the narrow entrance, Ethan saw two men near the trees. One wore a dark coat Ethan recognized immediately. Victor Hale stood in the snow, speaking sharply into a phone. His face turned partly away. The other man remained by a truck, but neither had seen the opened shelter yet. Ben lowered his voice. "We need official help before this turns ugly." They gathered what they could and hurried down the ridge by a different path. By late afternoon, Ben had called Sheriff Nolan Reed. a broad, tired-looking man who met them at the cabin with cautious skepticism. Ethan laid Samuel's journal, the letter, and the newly found ledgers across the table. Nolan read in silence, his expression changing slowly from doubt to concern. "I don't know what you've stepped into," he said finally, "but these records may matter." He agreed to secure the shelter the next morning, but before he left, Ethan opened one of the smaller metal boxes from the hidden chamber. Inside was a brittle cloth packet, and beneath it, set deep behind a folded ledger, lay a small black safe built into a broken section of stone. Its iron door marked with the same circle and cross symbol from beneath the stove. The small black safe looked too heavy for the broken stone that held it, as if Samuel had built the wall around it with his own hands and then trusted time to keep it buried. Sheriff Nolan Reed crouched beside the open box, shining his flashlight over the iron door and the circle and cross symbol pressed into its surface. "You said this same mark was under your stove?" he asked. Ethan nodded. On the stone that covered the first hatch, Ben stood near the window with his arms folded, watching the snowy darkness beyond the glass, as though Victor might appear from the trees at any moment. The sheriff tried the handle, but the safe did not move. Its lock was small, older than anything Ethan had seen, and dark with rust. "Don't force it," Ethan said quickly. Nolan glanced at him. "I wasn't planning to." His tone softened when he saw Ethan's face. "This matters to you." Ethan looked at the journal on the table. The old letter, the ledgers, the brass key, all the fragile pieces of a man nobody had wanted to remember. "I think it mattered to him first." Nolan said nothing for a moment. Then he stood. "I'll log what we found at the ridge. Tomorrow I'll get these papers copied properly and contact the county archive. But that safe stays here tonight, and nobody opens it alone." Ethan wanted to argue, but he knew the sheriff was right. They set the safe on the kitchen table, wrapped the ledgers in dry cloth, and secured the cabin as best they could. Ben refused to leave Ethan by himself, so he slept in his truck outside with a thermos of coffee and a tire iron beside the seat. Ethan stayed inside, too restless to sleep. He fed the stove, then sat near the table, studying the safe by firelight. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with all the things Samuel had left unsaid. Near dawn, Ethan remembered the small brass key had opened the shelter, but the original box had also held a dark string tied around it. He took out the key again, turning it over in his palm. Scratched along one side, nearly hidden by tarnish, were 4 tiny numbers. 1904. They were too neat to be damaged. When Nolan returned after sunrise with Ben and a small evidence pouch, Ethan showed him. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Could be a date, or a combination," Ben said. The safe had no dial, only a keyhole and 4 small rolling wheels along the side, stiff with age. Nolan worked them slowly with a gloved thumb until they aligned at 1904. Nothing happened. Ethan leaned closer. "Try the key after." Nolan inserted the brass key. It resisted, then turned with a tired, metallic click. The safe opened. Inside were no coins, no jewelry, no stack of money. There were folded invoices, construction receipts, a small notebook, and several letters tied with string. Ethan felt a strange relief. Treasure would have been simple. Paper meant truth. Nolan lifted the first receipt and read the heading aloud. "Hale Timber and Supply." Ben's jaw tightened. Victor's family. The documents were dated months before the fire. They listed beams, stovepipe, roofing materials, and support braces for the Ridge Supply Building. In the margins, Samuel had written notes in pencil, shorted order. Cracked support. Wrong grade lumber delivered. Warned foreman. Another page held a signed statement from a delivery driver admitting cheaper materials had been substituted after payment. The small notebook was Samuel's, but the handwriting inside was sharper, angrier than in the journal. He had recorded every warning he gave before the fire, every repair he tried to make himself, every refusal from men who told him to keep quiet because winter was no time to complain. Ethan read until his hands began to shake. Samuel had not caused the disaster. He had tried to prevent it. Nolan's expression darkened as he examined the letters. This is enough to reopen the historical file. Maybe more if records still exist. Ben let out a slow breath. No wonder Hale wanted the cabin. As if summoned by his name, the crunch of tires sounded outside. Ethan looked through the cracked front window and saw Victor's dark vehicle stopped near the gate. Victor stepped out, his coat buttoned tight against the wind, and walked toward the porch without waiting to be invited. Nolan opened the door before he could knock. "Morning, Victor." Victor paused when he saw the sheriff. His eyes moved over Ben, Ethan, then the papers spread across the table behind them. "I came to speak with the boy." "He has a name," Ben said. Victor ignored him. "You're making a mistake. Ethan. Old stories damage living people. Whatever you think you found, it won't bring anyone back." Ethan stood beside the table. Fear rose in him, but it did not feel as large as it had the night he was thrown out. It might bring someone's name back. Victor's face hardened. "You don't understand this town." Nolan stepped forward. "Then let the town decide." Victor looked at the safe, and for the first time Ethan saw real panic flicker beneath his polished calm. He left without another offer. After his car disappeared, the cabin remained silent except for the stove. Ethan turned back to the safe and found one final envelope tucked flat against the bottom, nearly missed beneath the lining. It was brittle, sealed, and written in Samuel's hand. Across the front were the words, "To the carter who finds this last." Ethan did not open Samuel's final envelope that morning. He wanted to, but Sheriff Nolan Reed stopped him with a raised hand before his thumb could break the brittle seal. "Not yet," the sheriff said. "If this is the last thing Samuel meant to say, we document everything else first." Ethan looked at the handwriting on the front, then nodded and placed the envelope back inside the safe. Waiting felt cruel. But after 60 years of silence, one more day would not erase Samuel. Nolan collected the receipts, ledgers, statements, journal pages, and photographs into separate folders, marking where each had been found. Ben helped carry the safe to the sheriff's vehicle, and Ethan followed them into town with a strange emptiness in his chest, as if the cabin had gone quiet again without the papers inside it. At the courthouse, Nolan copied every page twice. The county clerk, who had found no record of Samuel Carter only days earlier, now handled the documents with both hands, her face pale with embarrassment. "I can search the older disaster files," she said. "Some were never entered into the computer." Nolan nodded. "Start with the Ridge supply fire, winter of 1962. While they waited, Ethan sat on a wooden bench outside the records room with Ben beside him. People passed through the hallway, glancing at the young man in the patched jacket who had somehow walked into town carrying its buried past. Ethan felt small under their stares. Ben nudged his shoulder. "You all right?" "I keep thinking someone else should be doing this," Ethan admitted. "Someone older, someone who knew what they were looking for." "Maybe that's why it had to be you." Ben said. "You weren't looking for power. You were just trying to survive." By afternoon, the clerk emerged with a thin box labeled Ridge Fire. Inside were newspaper clippings, a damaged incident report, and statements copied so poorly that some lines had faded away. Samuel's name appeared only once, under suspected negligence. There were no witness statements defending him, no mention of the warnings he had written in his notebook, and no record of the substituted materials. Nolan's mouth tightened. This file was cleaned. He did not say by whom. He did not have to. The next 2 days moved faster than Ethan expected. Nolan contacted the county archive. The local newspaper sent a reporter after hearing the sheriff had reopened questions about the fire. Martha came to the courthouse with a folder of her own, containing a photograph of her father standing beside Samuel near the old ridge road. On the back, her father had written, "The man who brought medicine through the storm." Ben brought his grandmother's old family Bible, where a note in the margin thanked S. Carter for flour and lamp oil during the big snow. Sheriff Nolan found his own family name on one of Samuel's tags from the stone shelter and stared at it for a long time without speaking. More elderly residents came forward after the newspaper printed a short article asking for memories of the winter of 1962. Some remembered only fragments: a man with a sled, a cabin stove that never went cold, sacks of meal left on porches before dawn. One woman cried when she saw Samuel's photograph. "My mother said he saved my brother," she whispered. But later, nobody would say his name. Ethan listened to each story with a growing ache. Samuel was no longer just handwriting in a journal. He was becoming a voice carried by other people, a shape returning piece by piece. Yet each memory made the injustice sharper. A man had given everything he had, and the town had rewarded him by forgetting him. Victor Hale did not stay silent. He called the newspaper article irresponsible. He told people Ethan was a desperate boy chasing attention. Twice. Unfamiliar trucks slowed near the cabin after dark, though none came up the drive. Ben stayed over again, and Martha began calling each evening to make sure Ethan answered. The pressure frightened him, but it also showed him how close the truth must be. On the fourth day, Nolan asked Ethan, Ben, and Martha to return to the cabin with him. "I want to see the place the way Samuel used it," he said. Snow fell lightly as they stood inside the repaired but still rough kitchen. The stove had been pushed aside, the iron hatch uncovered, the hidden space below now empty. Nolan looked around at the patched windows, the salvaged boards, the small sleeping area near the wall. This wasn't just his home, he said. It was the center of the ridge network. Ethan looked at the stove, then at the shelves where supplies might once have waited. He imagined frightened families arriving in storms, Samuel opening the door, the fire already burning. For the first time, the cabin did not feel like something he had bought. It felt like something that had been entrusted to him. That evening, Nolan received a call from the town council. He listened quietly, then turned to Ethan. "They've scheduled a public hearing, Friday evening. They want the evidence presented in front of everyone." Martha closed her eyes. Ben let out a low whistle. Ethan looked toward the stove and the dark square of the open floor beneath it, knowing the secret that began there was about to face the whole town. By Friday evening, nearly every seat in the town hall was filled. Snow clung to boots lined against the back wall, and low conversations drifted through the room before the meeting began. Ethan had never stood in front of so many people. Only a few weeks earlier, he had been sleeping in the cab of his truck, wondering where his next meal would come from. Now he sat beside Sheriff Nolan Reed, Ben Dawson, and Martha Ellis. With Samuel Carter's journal resting carefully on the table before them, Across the room sat Victor Hale, dressed neatly as always, his expression unreadable. When the town council called the meeting to order, Nolan stood first. He spoke calmly, laying out the sequence of discoveries exactly as they had happened. The abandoned cabin, the hidden compartment beneath the stove, the journal, the mountain shelter, the ledgers, the safe. One by one, he placed copies of the documents before the council members. There was no dramatic speech, only evidence. Receipts showing inferior building materials purchased through Hale Timber and Supply. Samuel's written warnings about weakened support beams. The signed statement from the delivery driver confirming that cheaper lumber had been substituted after payment. The notebook recording every attempt Samuel had made to convince others to repair the Ridge Supply building before winter. As each document was read aloud, the room grew quieter. Victor finally rose from his seat. "Those papers are 60 years old," he said evenly. "No one can prove they weren't written afterward." Before Nolan could answer, Martha slowly stood. Her voice trembled with age, but not with fear. She told the council how Samuel had carried medicine through deep snow to save her little brother. She described the sled, the lantern, and the cabin fire that never seemed to go out. Then Ben stepped forward with his grandmother's Bible, opening it to the handwritten note thanking Samuel Carter for flour and lamp oil during the winter of 1962. An elderly woman in the back of the room stood next. Then another man. Soon, several older residents were speaking, each offering a memory that matched Samuel's journal. One remembered blankets left on his family's porch before sunrise. Another remembered Samuel repairing a chimney without accepting payment. None of them had understood why his name disappeared afterward. Ethan listened quietly as story after story returned Samuel to the room. The council members compared the witness accounts with the journal entries and found names, dates, and locations that matched almost perfectly. At last, the council chair looked toward Victor. "Do you wish to respond?" Victor remained standing for several seconds before speaking. "My grandfather owned the company then. I wasn't alive." "No one is accusing you of starting the fire," Nolan replied. "But these records strongly suggest that Samuel Carter warned people about unsafe materials and was blamed afterward for failures he tried to prevent." Victor lowered his eyes. "I knew there had always been questions," he admitted quietly. "My grandfather never allowed anyone to discuss them. By the time I inherited the business, everyone treated Samuel as the man responsible." The room remained silent. It was not a confession to a crime, but it was enough to acknowledge that the story the town had believed for decades had never been complete. After a brief private discussion, the council returned with its decision. The official historical record would be amended. Samuel Carter would no longer be listed as responsible for negligence in the Ridge fire. The newly discovered documents and witness testimony would become part of the county archive. A memorial plaque honoring those who survived the winter with Samuel's help would be placed near the mountain road the following spring. Ethan lowered his head as relief washed over him. Samuel would not remain forgotten. When the meeting ended, several residents approached Ethan, shaking his hand and thanking him for refusing Victor's offer to sell the cabin. Others apologized for what had happened to Samuel's memory, even though none of them had been alive when the decisions were made. Outside, snow drifted softly beneath the streetlights. Ben clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "You did it." Ethan smiled faintly. "We did." Martha hugged him without saying a word. On the drive back to the cabin, the mountain road felt different. Nothing around it had changed. The trees were the same, the snow was just as deep. Yet the silence no longer carried shame. It carried peace. Inside the cabin, Ethan placed the journal back on the table beside the black safe. As he carefully lifted the empty document tray from the bottom one final time before storing it away, his fingers brushed against something thin, hidden beneath the wooden lining. He gently pulled it free. It was the brittle, sealed envelope Samuel had addressed long ago in careful handwriting. For the Carter who finds this last. Ethan held the envelope for a long time before opening it. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the stove and the wind moving around the eaves. Ben had gone home after making sure Ethan had enough firewood for the night. Martha had called once from her landline, her voice tired but peaceful after the hearing. Sheriff Nolan had taken the official copies back to town. For the first time since buying the cabin, Ethan was alone with Samuel Carter, not as a mystery, but as family. He sat at the kitchen table, slid one finger carefully beneath the brittle seal, and unfolded the final letter. The handwriting was weaker than in the journal, but still steady enough to feel deliberate. To whoever carries our name when this is found, Samuel had written, I do not know whether you come here by need, accident, or mercy. I only know the world has a way of sending the right person to a lonely door. Ethan stopped and swallowed hard. Need, accident, mercy. All three had brought him here. Samuel wrote that he had hidden the first box beneath the stove because a fire kept people alive, and because every home should have one place where the truth could wait safely. He wrote that he had been called careless, bitter, and dangerous after the Ridge Fire, but he had never regretted trying to help the families trapped in the snow. If people forget my name, let them, the letter said. But if one of my blood finds this cabin again, remember this. A name is not restored by anger. It is restored by service. Ethan read the line twice. His eyes burned. He had imagined Samuel wanting revenge, wanting the Hales humiliated, wanting the town forced to admit what it had done. Instead, the final letter asked only that the cabin remain useful. Samuel wrote of his hope that one day the stove would burn again for someone cold, that the shelves would hold food again for someone hungry, and that no person sent away from one door would be left without another to knock on. Near the end, the letter grew more personal. I had a son who left before he understood me, Samuel wrote. Maybe he was right to go. Shame is a hard thing to inherit if you are his child or his child's child. Know this, you owe me nothing, but if this place has given you shelter, give shelter in return. Ethan lowered the letter to the table and covered his face with both hands. For 18 years, home had meant a place someone else could take away. A stepfather's anger, a locked door, a porch light going dark behind him. But this ruined cabin, bought with almost the last money he had given him something no one had ever handed him freely. It had given him a past, a purpose, and a reason to stay. The weeks that followed were hard, but they no longer felt hopeless. The town council arranged for the road to the cabin to be cleared properly after the spring thaw. Ben came on weekends with tools and leftover materials from repair jobs. Martha brought old photographs and stories, some about Samuel, some about families whose names had appeared in the shelter. Sheriff Nolan helped install a stronger lock on the door, though he joked that Ethan had already proved the cabin was better at keeping secrets than keeping out the cold. Word spread beyond the town after the newspaper published a longer article about Samuel Carter and the hidden records beneath the stove. Some people came out of curiosity. Others came with donations, canned goods, blankets, spare lumber, an old wood rack, 2 kerosene lamps, a stack of winter coats. Ethan accepted each item carefully, writing names in a notebook the way Samuel once had. He did not know much about running anything, but he knew what it felt like to sleep in a truck and wonder if anyone cared. That knowledge became enough to begin. By early summer, the cabin looked like a different place. The roof no longer sand. The windows held glass instead of plastic sheeting. The porch stood straight, with a simple bench facing the trees. Inside, one wall became a small display for Samuel's photograph. Copies of the journal pages, the brass key, and a map of the old ridge network. Beneath the display, Ethan placed a wooden sign, Ben carved by hand. Samuel Carter Winter Shelter. No one left out in the cold. The first night the shelter served its purpose came sooner than expected. A storm rolled in late in the season, catching a father and his young daughter on the mountain road after their car slid into a ditch. They reached the cabin soaked, frightened, and shivering. Ethan opened the door before they knocked twice. He gave the girl a blanket from the shelf, set soup on the stove, and watched color return slowly to their faces. The father tried to apologize for the trouble. Ethan only shook his hand. This is what the place is for. After they slept safely near the fire, Ethan stepped outside onto the porch. Snow fell through the darkness, quiet and steady. For a moment, he imagined Samuel standing beside him, looking out at the same trees, listening to the same winter silence. There was no voice, no sign, no miracle. Just the warmth behind him and the knowledge that someone who needed help had found the door open. The following spring, the town placed Samuel's memorial plaque near the mountain road. Martha attended in her best coat. Ben stood beside Ethan. Sheriff Nolan read the corrected record aloud, naming Samuel Carter not as the man who caused the Ridge tragedy, but as one who warned against it and helped many survive the winter that followed. Victor Hale came too, standing at the edge of the crowd. He did not speak to Ethan, but when the ceremony ended, he removed his hat before the plaque and left quietly. Ethan found that he did not need more from him. The truth had done what anger could not. It had stayed. That evening, Ethan returned to the cabin alone. He carried Samuel's final letter inside and placed it in a protective frame beside the journal. Then he and Ben moved the restored cast-iron stove back over the repaired section of floor, not to hide the hatch again, but to honor where everything had begun. Ethan left the outline of the iron door visible in the boards, with the carved stone mounted nearby so visitors could see the mark that had waited under ash and dust for 60 years. When the stove settled into place, the cabin felt complete. Ethan stood in the warm room and listened to the fire catch. He was no longer the boy sleeping in a truck with $47 and nowhere to go. He was the keeper of a story, the caretaker of a shelter, and the last Carter Samuel had trusted without ever knowing his name. Outside, snow began to fall again over the mountain. Inside, the old stove glowed red, and beneath it, where a secret had once waited in darkness, a home had finally been found. The greatest secret hidden beneath the old stove was never gold, cash, or a forgotten fortune. It was the truth. Samuel Carter. Ethan's great-grandfather had built the snow cabin as the heart of a quiet rescue network during the brutal winter of 1962. Hidden beneath the floor and inside a second mountain shelter were food, medicine, blankets, records, and carefully preserved evidence proving that Samuel had spent months saving isolated families while warning local officials that the Ridge Supply Building had been constructed with dangerously inferior materials. When the building later burned, powerful men shifted the blame onto Samuel to protect their own reputations and businesses. His name was erased from public records. His family drifted apart under the weight of shame, and the cabin was abandoned until everyone who remembered the truth was nearly gone. The documents Ethan uncovered: Samuel's journals, witness letters, supply ledgers, receipts, and signed statements finally restored the missing history. The town officially cleared Samuel's name, recognizing him not as the man responsible for the tragedy, but as one of the people who had prevented an even greater loss of life. The final letter Samuel left behind revealed the most important truth of all. He never wanted revenge. He never wanted compensation. He only hoped that if one of his descendants ever found the cabin again, they would keep its door open for strangers in need. Ethan realized that he had not inherited a hidden treasure. He had inherited a purpose. The abandoned cabin became a winter shelter and small memorial where travelers, struggling families, and anyone caught in the mountain storms could always find warmth, food, and a safe place to stay. The boy who had arrived with nowhere to call home became the caretaker of the very place that had once given hope to an entire community. And in the end, the greatest thing hidden beneath that old stove was never something Samuel had buried. It was the legacy of kindness that had been waiting patiently for someone brave enough to uncover it and carry it forward.